Here we are. I'm going to start again. Welcome, everyone. We're pretty excited to have the three amigos and an interloper who has just joined us and left. But here we are. You know, the Charter for Compassion has had a long association with the three amigos. There's a brand new amigo, and we've been together for almost every World Interfaith Harmony Week. I don't know if you remember that, but since probably 2014, either you've been live or we have done recordings. We've been together in Encuentro Mundial de Valores in Mexico, which was really pretty exciting. And coming up, we'll be together at Parliament, World Religions in Chicago, actually in just 2 weeks. So, this is kind of a reunion. And it's also an opportunity for people to get a little sneak preview of what's going to happen at the Parliament in the way of the association with the Interfaith Amigos. And so I'm going to turn it over to them in a second, but to say that Jamal, Rahman, Donald, or we call him Don, Mackenzie, and Laura is the brand new member of the three amigos. It was Ted Falcon before, but now it's Rabbi Duhan Kaplan, and they have now become international. Before they just were national. So this is pretty exciting. So I'm going to turn it over to the three, and let's see what we're in store for.
That's great. Thank you so much, Marilyn. Thanks so much to the Charter for Compassion for hosting this and helping to put this webinar together. And for anyone who wants to see what the Charter is up to and what they'll be offering at the Parliament of World Religions, please go to the beautiful new updated Charter website and learn about their global work. I'm Rabbi Laura Duhan Kaplan, the newest member of our group. In my day job, I am Director of Interreligious Studies and Professor of Jewish Studies at the Vancouver School of Theology. I'm also Rabbi Emerita of Or Shalom Synagogue, and I'd like to give my colleagues Jamal and Don a moment to introduce themselves. Jamal, you first.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm Imam at the Interfaith Community Sanctuary in Seattle, Washington, where we foster a living, breathing interfaith community. And we believe that, all religions are paths to a shared universal. And I'm so delighted to be also 1/3 of the Interfaith Amigos. Amen.
Amen. Yeah. And I'm Pastor Don Mackenzie. I'm a minister of the United Church of Christ, the Congregational Free Church tradition in the United States. And I've been a part of the Interfaith Amigos since the beginning at 9/11. And so we're very enthusiastic to welcome Rabbi Laura Duhan Kaplan to our trio and to give us new life. Thanks be to God. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks to both of you. And I'm the Canadian that gives us the international focus. Our topic for today, we've called it Spiritual Responses to Imperial Religion. And perhaps we might add spiritual responses to contemporary imperial religion with some learnings from past responses. It is a very big topic. We're just beginning our collaborative discussions about it. Our discussions are a mashup of developing political understandings, drawing on the intellectual resources of our three traditions, and also looking at spiritual practices that help develop in us the courage and the compassion to move forward in productive and activist ways today. And we'll go into these ideas a little bit more for the rest of the hour and also at our presentation at the Parliament of World Religions. And today we will each speak for about 10 minutes on the topic. I'll speak first, then Dawn, and then Jamal. And then we will each briefly introduce a spiritual practice. Jamal first, then Dawn, then me. And if there's some time at the end, we'll take some questions via the chat. So I will start perhaps with maybe some definitions of imperial religion. What do we mean by the religion of empire? And maybe I'll begin with the Oxford Dictionary definitions of empire. The first two definitions. Number one, an empire is an extensive group of states or countries or nations gathered under a single supreme authority. Definition two, an empire is a large commercial organization owned or controlled by one person or one group. And sometimes the two come together when there is an extensive group of states or nations or countries that is organized as a kind of commercial enterprise to benefit a small group of people. What does an imperial religion look like? What does religion that develops under empire or into empire look like? Well, each of the three of us has started to answer that question in a different way, looking at our own tradition. Don started to think about how much of his tradition, Christianity, has been shaped through the practice of imperial expansion. And he is beginning to ask, or rather continuing the discussion that so many others have started about how Christians can and should develop a different relationship to power. Jamal has started to think about how his tradition, Islam, which has been a global religion for so long, how many began to turn their attention toward administering the internal empire of religious bureaucracy and began to turn attention away from the tradition's roots in spiritual practice. And he looks at how Muslims can call each other and others back into a focus on spiritual practice. And I started to think about how my home tradition of Judaism lived for so many centuries, perhaps millennia, at the margins of empire. And from that position, we developed many strong critiques of empire. We developed visions of alternative ways to live. And we were also fearful of what our place might be within the empires where we lived. But nowadays, and perhaps due to that fear, that analysis will not be part of my last few minutes, but perhaps because of fear, when we had the chance to participate in imperial ways of governing, we began to adopt some of the worst practices of empire. So I would like to look at how we can get back to our critiques and an understanding of our visions of inclusive, smaller communities. And to draw on a Jewish critique of empire, I turn to the first book of the prophet Isaiah, which was written in approximately the 8th century BCE, just as the northern Israelite kingdom was threatened with invasion from the Assyrian Empire. The prophet Isaiah describes empires in a very negative light. He talks about great regional empires like the Assyrian Empire, the Egyptian empire, for example, of that time. And he says, their land is full of chariots and war horses. They scour the region for mines and forests and resources that they can bring home to enrich themselves. Not only do they fill their land with gold and silver, but they begin to worship that gold and silver as their gods. What will call them back to right living? Isaiah is not very hopeful about the process through which that will happen. When they lose control of their wealth, then they will have to begin to ask themselves, right, what is true spirituality? What is true caring? What is true community? And how can we find our way back to right living? And for a vision of what right living can look like, I turn to the biblical book of Leviticus, which, according to many scholars, was written about 100 years later than the first part of Isaiah. So about the 7th century BCE. And I know that many who try to read the biblical book of Leviticus are overwhelmed by the technical instructions for the priests. And yet what shines through that is a vision for an ideal small community. It is not a perfect vision, but it has many powerful elements that we can draw on. The book of Leviticus understands the health of a community as the health of an energy field, or maybe a very delicate force field. And grief, illness, crime, disruption between people, anxiety, all of these disrupt the energy field of this community. And to reset the energy field, people support one another in restitution, people support one another in rituals of restitution when crimes have been committed, rituals of healing, rituals of grieving together. People support and witness one another in these rituals. In the ideal community of Leviticus, it is also important for everyone to participate as equals. Leviticus understands that some people may be blessed with more wealth than others, but it insists that people who have more share with those who have less. What kinds of people should people share their wealth with? Every kind of person. Leviticus is explicit about that. Local people, transients, relatives, strangers, women, men, people with disabilities, people with wealth, people who are poor. Major landowners must hire people to work in their fields, pay them a living wage, and pay them promptly. When people borrow money from one another, the loans must be interest-free, because without interest-free loans, people get caught in a spiral of escalating debt. The book of Leviticus further says that every 7th year, the community must do an extreme economic reset. Farmers, particularly large landowners, must let their fields lie fallow. Whatever grows is left for people to glean and for wild animals to share. And every 50th year, all debts are forgiven. I think I left out the part about the annual harvest time food bank that Leviticus insists, right, all successful farmers must offer. The book of Leviticus is also explicit about why these kinds of caring practices and economic practices are required, because without them, the book says, the community's energy field starts to fail. People are anxious. People become fearful. They see imaginary enemies chasing them. They lose the ability out of their fear to share what little they now have with one another. They become unable to unite in self-defense. And at that point, they become vulnerable to invasion from larger acquisitive empires. Is there hope? The book of Leviticus says there absolutely is hope, and the hope lies in finding our way to as much of these kinds of practices as we can implement. And I'll also share a spiritual practice in a bit that looks toward becoming the kind of people who take joy in abundant, simpler communities. Thanks. And over to you, Don.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Rabbi Laura, what a pleasure it is to have you with us. You give Jamal and me so much vitality. And I love the image you said of the energy field of a community. I think that's very palpable. Christianity. When speaking about Christianity, I think the first thing to say is that it's the largest religious tradition in the world, but it's also a kind of domination system, which is harmful because of the claims of supremacy. It's inconsistent with the teachings of what we know about the teachings of Jesus. So there's an important prelude to note when we talk about Christianity. And I'm just going to say, imagine this. 100,000 years ago, our primitive ancestor out on some lonely hillside on an ancient evening with arms outstretched releases a primal cry. One might argue that this was the first music, the first externalization of something inarticulate. But we could also argue it's the first spiritual moment, when that deep yearning to answer the question, are we alone, is expressed. And though this is a primitive moment, we all understand it because the question is also ours right now. That yearning has been a constant throughout human history. We sing about it, we talk about it, we write about it, we cry about it, we laugh about it. It forms an undercurrent to the ordinary experiences of our lives. We can be imprisoned by these things because we're all prisoners of some kind, aren't we? And yet we can also be released into new chapters of our lives because at least partially fulfilling that primitive yearning. One of my favorite songs that embraces much of this is the song, How Can I Keep From Singing, which I first heard probably 50 years ago from Pete Seeger. My life flows on an endless song above earth's lamentation. I hear the real, though far off hymn that hails a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear that music ringing. It finds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? So there comes a moment in the life of every human being when the yearning for hope eclipses almost everything else. It can bring us to our knees, can make us cry, even laugh, and create an awareness of an experience of life beyond the ordinary. And perhaps it was some collective sense of this among the Jewish peasants of the Roman occupation of Palestine that responded to the preaching and teaching of one named Jesus of Nazareth. It was in the years following his execution, as people began to tell stories about his teachings and his ministries, that the larger sense of all this became known as the way, the way. It was a movement of resistance to the dominant political and cultural powers of the time, And as we know, if movements survive, they require institutions to provide boundaries, guidelines, qualifications for membership, and proclamations of the message. This is what orthodoxy is: the creation of institutions that protect and separate. But nothing's unambiguous here. I'm thinking of one of the greatest hymns in Orthodox Christianity, from the great Lutheran pastor, German Lutheran pastor, Philip Nicolai, whose ministry included a seemingly unending series of funerals because of the wars going on in Germany at the time of his ministry. It's titled, "Wake, Awake, for Night is Flying," a song, a hymn of hope. Wake, awake, for night is flying. The watchmen on the heights are crying, "Awake, Jerusalem, at last." Midnight hears the welcome voices, and at the thrilling cry rejoices. There are so many voices and so many nuances in the story of Christianity. It's impossible to tell just one story, but the claim of supremacy makes Christianity imperial, and imperial is a nasty word. In an attempt to paint the broadest picture of the substance of Christianity, it's important to note two very important themes. The first, as the message of Jesus was being conveyed through stories and later through writing, it was also in the process of being Hellenized because of the movement into the Greco-Roman culture of Asia Minor. This is where the word imperial fits into Christianity. Encounters between the Christian community and the Roman Empire contributed to adding political and cultural aspects of empire to the Christian community, namely hierarchy, patriarchy, coercive power, greed, superstition, and of course, egocentrism. The consequence was a movement away from the prophetic and healing message of Jesus toward the imperial need to identify the one true way. Everything else was and is heresy. This imperial sensibility continued into the Eastern Orthodox traditions after the Great Schism of 1054 and into the Protestant traditions after the Reformation. In other words, the church became a strong part of the powers that be. Again, orthodoxy. At the same time, though, deeply intertwined in and through the substance of the picture above was another theme, which was concerned more with the well-being of the common good, the prophetic and mystical dimensions of the teachings of Jesus. This theme constituted a perpetual challenge to the imperial dimensions and can be understood as a kind of historic conversation or dance between and among the dominant themes of imperial faith and that subdominant theme of its challenger. Figures such as Peter Abelard, Martin Luther, Teresa of Avila, Martin Luther King Jr., and Dietrich Bonhoeffer are figures that might be understood as theologians of resistance. And while this theme differed in substance from the imperial theme, it was not completely free of the imperial negative aspects. These were, after all, human beings. As these two experiences grew and matured and over time became intertwined, so much so that ordinary people probably didn't even notice that there were actually at least two big things going on. In the spaces that developed between these two themes, the spaces between, two types of energy developed and need to be named. The first is the tension between the illusion of certainty and the reality of uncertainty. And the second is the difference between, or the tension between the people we are and the people we dream of becoming. Because of all the features of what it means to be human are attached to both of these themes, it seems correct to identify the spaces between these two strands in terms of paradox, subtlety, and ambiguity. Are we talking about good guys and bad guys? No. No, we're talking about human beings with a wide variety of experiences and conditionings. Conditionings meaning those things that contribute to the things we take for granted. In both of these themes, most people were acting responsibly according to the standards of their time. In contrast, though, today, we have more tools available. For example, if we identify the core teachings of our traditions, then we can measure the verses and practices against them and discover which verses and practices actually contain spiritual wisdom and which are simply the consequence of ego yearning, egocentrism. Second, we are more and more and more aware of the historic and current importance of spiritual practices, as well as the importance of maintaining a spiritual sensibility between the gatherings of the community, so that after worship, that spiritual sensibility doesn't fall off the cliff and get buried until the next time the community gathers. And then finally, we are aware of the reality that life hangs in a balance between despair and hope, And this is the strong message of the musical form, the blues. So without despair, there'd be no song. Without hope, you couldn't sing it. And in the blues, the blue or bent note opens a crack in the monolith of despair and lets hope shine through. As a musician, I find this very, very important. So this is all to say that inside this constantly intertwining dance of the imperial, that is the one true way theme, and the prophetic theme, which concludes oneness, unconditional love, and compassion, there is both shadow and light, despair and hope, nuance and paradox. In religion, it is in this dance that the yearning for hope acquires moral value. It hopes for something good, and as it says in Romans 5 in the New Testament, hope does not disappoint us, but you have to sing the song. Over to you, Jamal.
Thank you so much, Brother Don. What a joy it is to be, as I always say, in these rectangles of love with my interfaith amigo, Brother Don, and my interfaith amiga, Sister Laura. So I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the Prophet Muhammad's life, 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula. You know, when he was born in that era, in that place, it was called a time and a place of Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah means savagery, because in 7th century Arabia, they practiced female infanticide, terrible oppression of slaves, exploitation of the poor, abuse of the poor, and a lot of bloodshed, intertribal warfare. So Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, even as a child, he would go into the mountains in Mecca and just sit in silence. And one historical evening, we know the date, 610 CE. We even know the month. We don't know the exact day of the month, but it's a very, for Muslims, it's a remarkable, shall I say, seismic event, because that's where, when the Prophet Muhammad was meditating in the cave in Mecca, just feeling so much despair about the savagery of his time, that he encountered Angel Gabriel. And the first verses of the Quran descended upon Prophet Muhammad, and Muhammad became a prophet. This was, as I said, in the year 610, and that spiritual experience is called the Night of Destiny. And then this man Muhammad, who became a prophet, he declared La ilaha illallah, which is at the core of Islam. He's asking all of us to turn away from the worship of the ego that idolizes money and power. Literally, the word means, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God. It's a lifelong, lifetime struggle to bring God, divine traits and qualities into the center of our life and not ego traits. So he declared that the core teaching of Islam was compassion, and we have to be just. The Quranic verse is, be just, be just. This is closest to being God conscious. Of course, this did not sit well with the elite in Mecca, and he was forced to migrate from Mecca to Medina. That's called the Hijrah. The movement, the migration. In fact, so important is this term, the Hijrah, is the first year of the Muslim calendar. This was in the year 622, and he lived only 10 more years. He died in 632 CE, but in those 10 years, he was able to unite the warring tribes and lay the foundation for an Islamic civilization to emerge in just 10 years. How did he do that? Well, number one, he built community. Got together all the warring tribes. You know, this has inspired Islamic mystics to say, a wall standing alone is useless. Add to it other walls, it can support a roof, a granary. Only when ink joins with a pen can the blank paper say something. So he built community. Number two, he insisted on doing spiritual practices. And the Quran has several stages of how to transform your ego from a commanding master into a personal assistant. How to open up your heart. So this was key. Do spiritual practices. Otherwise, in fighting injustice, we might ourselves become unjust. In fighting extremism, I might myself become extreme unless I do spiritual practices. And number three, he said, make alliances with like-minded groups. Create a movement at the grassroots level. This inspired, Rumi has a wonderful poetry. The ocean takes care of every wave till it reaches shore. But when the waves get together, they can overcome continents. Such is the power of waves getting together. So grassroots level alliances, critical. Otherwise, we cannot create what is very important. The Quran insists, creating structural changes. The sentence is to free a slave from bondage, literally and metaphorically, personally and collectively. Okay, so that's one point I wanted to make. The other point I wanted to make was, and this is something which is actually particularly highlighted by many academic professors. I'll mention one, the late Bernard Lewis, very famous professor from Princeton, who said, it's important to know that Islam for 1,000 years was a privileged religion, just like Christianity is today. And how do we know that? He has criteria. Who had the largest geographical empire? It was Islam. Strongest economic power? Islam. Strongest military? Islam. And what Muslims like to believe, a beautiful flowering of arts, sciences, literature. But today, if you ask poorest of the poor, the most illiterate of the illiterate, the largest number of war refugees, it's Muslims. A very severe decline after 1,000 years. What happened? Why? Just the way I said it. How did I say it? Number one, number one, number one, number one. You see, Prophet Muhammad was asked, what would you say are the causes for the downfall of humanity? And Prophet Muhammad said three things. Number one is pride, arrogance. In the Quran, this is exemplified by the Pharaoh who says, I am your Lord, worship me. There's another verse in the Quran that says, have you seen that person who worships his own ego? That's arrogance. That's pride. Number two is greed. Either Prophet Muhammad or Hazrat Ali said it, we don't quite know, that a wonderful insight. Give a person 2 valleys of gold, give a person 2 valleys of gold, and he or she will yearn for a 3rd valley of gold. Greed. Third one is envy, jealousy. Prophet Muhammad said, beware of jealousy, because envy, jealousy burns righteous deeds, burns away good deeds, just as fire burns wood. So now, when religion becomes imperial, it becomes a brand name. It becomes infused with pride, greed, jealousy. It wants to be number one, number one, number one. So it focuses on the institution of religion. When it becomes imperial, it focuses on 2 things: recruitment at any cost and fundraising, more and more money. It loses sight of the real purpose of religion. To become a more complete human being, doesn't matter what your religion, more Christ-like, Buddha-like, Elohim-like, Krishna-like. And number 2, being of service to God's creation. You know, I'm from Bangladesh. This wonderful Bengali poet Tagore, I love his insight. He says, you know, while God waits for his or her temple, house of worship to be made out of love, while God waits for his or her temple to be made out of love, man brings stones. And a very important point the sages say, we lose sight of our identity. We lose sight of what defines success, fulfillment. In defining myself, defining you, I focus on the outer reality. What is your status? How much money do you have? What kind of car do you drive? You know, superficial things. It's important. But what about the capacity for that inner reality, capacity for being loving, compassionate, forgiving, generous, gracious? And that's how we define success. How much money, how much power, status. That's good too. But again, what about the capacity for being a true human being? We lose sight of the joy one feels to be of service. You know, I love that wonderful, again, I'm quoting Tagore. If I remember his quotation, I slept and dreamt life was joy. I slept and dreamt life was joy. I awoke and found life was service. I served, and lo, service was joy. And there's another important point here. The Quran says, when we don't do this inner work, we're unable to create those structural changes. And the verse in the Quran is, Jamal, you did not climb the steep ascent. You avoided it. You ignored it. And it says, the first thing it says is, as I mentioned earlier, to free a slave from bondage. There's a wonderful saying of the Prophet Muhammad, who says, Jamal, if you experience oppression, use your hands, do something. That's real service. If you cannot do that, use your mouth, speak out against it. And yes, if you cannot do that, yes, pray, use your heart to send out light and love. But he said in this instance, it is the lowest form of faith. Okay, so I want to end this just by saying I am hopeful, like Brother Don said. the darkest hour is before dawn. You see, in my lifetime, I never imagined that in my lifetime I would see the crumbling of communism, the Berlin Wall coming down, the dissolving of apartheid, an African American in the White House. Because what has happened is, while a lot of darkness and difficulties around, there have been people who have been doing the inner work, who have been creating alliances, and with patience, with persistence, with sincerity, they have really been continuing to do this work, which is why we've had all these wonderful seismic shifts. So I am very hopeful. Thank you. Sister Laura, did you want me to start with those spiritual practices?
That would be perfect. Please introduce us to one.
Okay. I have one with 3 subsections, but I'll be very, very brief. What is my favorite practice? It is, oops, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
You can hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I see myself frozen. Oh, I look frozen, but okay. So the first practice is to become aware of myself through compassionate self-witnessing, to become aware of all my ego traits, my divine.
Now you are freezing.
Yeah, we lost you, Jamal. Oops.
Would you like to take a turn, Dawn? And then
Yeah,
when
sure.
Jamal comes back, he can
I will.
continue.
Jamal, you left us right at the point of increased enthusiasm there. I want to say, first of all, that I think spiritual practices are about opening the heart, whether it's worshiping in community or alone. And that's something we often seem to lose, that sense. And the other thing is that spiritual practices can remind us that what we so blithely refer to as the sacred is everywhere. And so I want to just bring forward once again this notion of the blues, where we are once again reminded that life hangs in the balance between despair and hope, and offer it as an opportunity to become more reflective as human beings about the reality that everything is sacred and that every time is sacred, not just the day that we worship or even Shabbat and so forth. And one of my favorite examples of this, and I think this may be a clue I need to update my cultural references, but the song Goodnight Irene, which was heard by Leadbelly when he was in prison. And he rewrote it a little bit, but it embraces both despair and hope. For example, in the verses, we hear the despair. The first verse is, sometimes I live in the country, sometimes I live in town, and sometimes I take a great notion to jump in the river and drown. How much more despair can we get? But in the chorus is the hope. Good night, Irene, I'll see you in my dreams. Is that hopeful? That song is a blues song, and the irony is it's a waltz. So it doesn't follow the usual pattern of blues constructions, but it's a great example. And so I think finding ways to become more aware of the sacred, both in place and time around us, and the need to open our hearts to others in ways that are not what a friend of mine used to call churchy, are really important. So that's good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dreams. Jamal, you're back.
Yes.
Okay.
I was finishing. I was saying should I just make my last point?
Sure.
Yeah. I was saying, I do.
No, I think you were just starting. You were just starting to introduce the practice.
Oh, from the beginning?
Yeah, we lost you.
Oh, okay. So I'll keep it very short. So my main spiritual practice is compassionate self-witnessing. Like Prophet Muhammad said, know thyself and you shall know thy sustainer. He also said, die before you die. Die to all that is false within you before you die a physical death. So number one is compassionate self-witnessing. I also do, I must say, following this, the Quran says Allah is outside of you and inside of you. So I keep telling my heart, I love you, because God is also inside my heart. And I always, when I'm in my meditation, my waking hours, I send light and love as much as I can to the outside world. And lastly, doing righteous deeds. And I just want to end by saying, Prophet Muhammad said, do good deeds according to your capacity. God never tires of giving rewards unless you tire of doing good deeds. The good deeds most loved by God are the ones that are done regularly, no matter how small they are. So that's the third thing I do. Thank you.
Well, so beautiful. I'll add one more. This is the traditional Jewish practice of blessing, of cultivating an attitude of awe, AWE, and radical amazement and gratitude. In our time, at least in North American culture, there are so many forces conspiring to teach us that we are not enough or we don't have enough. And these eat away at us in so many different ways. And one of the counterbalances to that is to begin to recognize all the ways in which we are enough. And there's great potential in the world around us, in the land, as I learned from my Indigenous colleagues, and in relationships with others, as I learned from my own family. The Jewish practice of blessing invites us to find 100 reasons a day It might be that flower. It might be that we notice someone doing something kind for someone else. It might be that we receive a great wise teaching and we want to pause and acknowledge that. So 100 times a day, we pause and say a phrase that roughly translates as, bless you, Spirit that infuses all, for, and then we fill in the blank, for allowing this bee to pollinate the flower, for giving my friend the strength to support another friend, for bringing this wisdom my way through the mouth of my grandchild, or whatever that amazing moment is. And when you practice this, you begin to see just how much abundance there is in the world around us and how much we are fed through the land, through the natural world, and through the people who are closest to us. That's a brief introduction to the practice.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. And when you say also that a very critical practice for us is to build and create for us a circle of love, a community, particularly a community of spiritual companions. That would be very critical for us to evolve continuously and evolve into the fullness of our being, become more developed as a human being.
Mm.
You know, I love the words of the Prophet Muhammad, who said, you know, your spiritual practices are only as good as those of your closest friends. Choose your closest friends wisely.
And, you know, I think it's also not a mistake that we're the three of us representing different traditions rooted in the Abrahamic story, of course. But what we're showing here in talking about the spiritual response to imperial faith is that the similarities between and among our traditions are very strong. There are differences, but they don't need to be seen as irreconcilable, because they're simply the particulars helping us to see our own traditions more clearly, but not to show that we are better or separate from the others. And so underneath this whole text is the importance of what we call interfaith understanding, coming, of course, from dialogue, but moving to action, cooperation, and addressing the great moral issues that we are facing.
Yeah, thank you both. And speaking of creating communities and evolving into large traditions, there are some excellent questions in the chat.
Oh,
There are two that are linked. Well, maybe they're linked, maybe they're not linked. Let me read them, and perhaps we can each take a moment to reflect on the one that calls to us. Question number one: is it true that for movements to survive, they need to be institutionalized? Does institutionalization mean that the movement moves into an imperial way? And question number two: in many cases, have we not taken the practices out of religion and now call them spiritual? Would you like me to go first?
Yes.
And then I'll turn it over to you to reply?
Yeah, good.
So the first question: is it true that for movements to survive, they need to be institutionalized? Well, I do think that they need to be cross-generational. So there need to be instruction about the cause and information and enthusiasm about the cause transmitted. But what is also crucial is the way that it is transmitted. What is it that is being institutionalized, and what do we mean by institution? There are ways of passing on practices and ways of being that are more democratic and that begin to bring in the voices of people who are being attracted to the work. It's slow. It means there are a lot of meetings. It means that it's messy. But if you take a lesson from indigenous peoples of North America who used these kinds of strategies for millennia, it does work to sustain movements and to sustain values. That's my 2 cents on that one.
can I just add to
And
that?
the question,
If I'd like to add to the first one.
sure, yes, let's talk about that one.
Yeah. So, even the first one, what is an institution? It's basically a collection of egos in different stages of development. So and all institutions, they suffer from what is called deferred maintenance. That's because we're not taking care of our ego. So, in fact, Prophet Muhammad alluded to this, that for any institution to flourish, to survive, and to grow, we have to continuously do our inner work, what is called the inner inconvenient work, rather than focus on discussions about theology too much. So Prophet Muhammad, for example, after a battle, because he was always being attacked, he would say, we have come from the lesser struggle, let's do the greater struggle. What's the greater struggle? He would say, the real enemy is between your ribs, your ego. You've got to transform it from a commanding master to a personal assistant. And the last thing I want to say is this over focus on discussion and debates about theology in an institution. Doesn't matter what it is, religious, political, that theology. I love Rumi, who says, when we get too involved in discussions and debates about theology, we're like a bird that ties a knot around its leg and unties it. Makes the knot even more complex and unties it. Makes it even more complex and unties it to show off its strange skill, forgetting the point is to escape. That's the purpose, to become saved, to become free, to become, to become surrendered. So anyhow, that's the comment I wanted to make. Thank you. Go ahead, Brother Duhan.
Yeah, that's what a great question. I mean, I think it's one I struggle with. We do all the time. And is there a difference, for example, between religion and what we call faith communities? When you have 2 or 3 people coming together to talk about spiritual wisdom, you really have the beginnings, at least, of an institution. And what we really have to do, and I think Laura and Jamal have covered it, is to learn to monitor how well we are fulfilling the purpose for which the institution was created, rather than simply maintaining the institution, which is so much of what institutions do, whether they're religion, education, government, political, whatever. And that's not easy, but I think as that kind of awareness grows, we'll be better off in terms of our institution's ability to convey spiritual wisdom.
Excellent. And this segues into this last question about, have we not taken the practices out of religion and now call them spiritual? And maybe I will just go first.
Yeah, good.
In my opinion, right, religions are many things and do many things, and spirituality is one part of what we now call religion. There are so many other aspects of culture and economics and historical activities that complicate and deepen religion. But I don't think that spiritual practices were necessarily birthed in religious traditions. I think they are human development practices, practices that come out of that kind of yearning that you talked about, Dawn, and that kind of unease with our own ego that you talked about, Jamal, and the desire to find ways to transcend our individuality and be parts of a community, or to be part of a being or a reality that is larger than ourselves. And those are human practices. Religious traditions give them particular flavors. So I think it's more that we have imported spiritual practices into what we now call religion.
And I can also add to that, for example, in Islam, there is the religious practice of praying, where you bow and prostrate to God. It can be ritualistic, or it can be spiritual. When that practice becomes spiritual, then I am doing that prostration to God with sincerity, with humility, and I am being present. I am there. I'm not thinking about something else. That is what makes it spiritual. That is what gives power to what is said, one prostration of prayer to God liberates you from 1,000 prostrations to your ego, depending on what energy, what spirit are you giving to that practice. It can be just a ritual, or it can be done with great humility and sincerity.
And I would say my two colleagues have said it just perfectly. Thank you. Yeah.
I wanted to add, for example, prayers of supplication. Oh God, I want, I want this, I want that. I can just through rote just say it. Rumi says, well, when you do prayers of supplication, do it with increased necessity. That is what makes it spiritual. Meaning, he gives an example. Have you not noticed that only when a baby is born does the mother's chest become filled up with milk? There is an increased necessity. So if I pray with fervor, with sincerity, with humility, from the core of my being, that is what makes it spiritual.
Thank you all so much. Marilyn, will you bring us home?
I'm going to bring you home, and I don't know why, Jamal, you just reminded me of the Janis Joplin song, "Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz?" I feel like I'm a heretic here, but it just popped into my mind. Thank you all for this. I have a bunch of questions, especially around that whole historical piece of spirituality and origins. And the other one that comes to mind also is the fact that, Jamal, going back to what you said, was that comes from the Prophet Muhammad about the company that you keep, basically, and how the need of creating a circle, and how spirituality, I think, encompasses that circle. I think that's a deep conversation because of right now with the approach of mindfulness, and spiritual circles or circles of trust, or, and it goes on and on and on, and how we bring all of this together, which is really delightful. And you're helping me remember my days of studying comparative religion. What a great avenue the three of you are to remember that. Thank you again, and we're looking forward to seeing you, and for all those lucky people who get to go to the Parliament of World Religions to interact with you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Blessings.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.